of old age.
Yeah.
Now, in a previous talk, I talked a lot about the third age and Peter Laslitt's work and how we've discovered only very recently since the war really, since the last war, that there is a new section of our lives which was hardly catered for by previous social structures. Nowhere in the world were you likely to have 30 or 40 years after you retired where you could lead a pretty meaningful and fulfilling intellectual and physical life. It's a new luxury and a new product of modern medicine and demography and wealth in the society. And we're only now beginning, and that ties up with associationalism, because how do you deal with that? You set up the University of the Third Age and you form into little interest groups and you go on tours to Venice with your friends and walking tours and so on, as my elderly relatives and friends are doing. So I talked about that in relation to the third age, but there is the fourth age, and I didn't talk about that much. I mentioned it. The fourth age is the age of dependency. It means that either basically your body or your mind or both break down, or at least you are no longer able by self-control and your use of those facilities to run your life independently. And so for most people now, I suppose, it's any time from the mid-80s onwards. Many fortunate people, it doesn't happen at all until they're in their late 90s. As I mentioned, Sarah's grandmother was mentally fine until she was 112, but her body was beginning to give way, and that's really why she went into a sheltered accommodation for the last 15 years or so of her life. Now, it's something which, even more than the third age, is a completely new phenomenon, because a person whose body or mind was cracking up in all the world until the last 30, 40 years would die. You know, they would, if it was their body, they would have a terminal illness of old age, which is very common, or they would just have an injury. I mean, they just a cut or a sore or a falling down, and you were dead because there was nothing much people could do about it, and you get gangrene and so on and so on. So you died. And likewise, if you were mentally lost your memory and so on, you would probably be neglected and you would quickly die. So the fact that now we will, in the next, and we're thinking in terms of our children and grandchildren, if things go on and we don't kill ourselves and wealth accumulates throughout the world, there'll be something like, say, 15 to 20% of our population, millions, billions. You're talking, you know, half of a billion people at least who are unable to look after themselves in some way. What are we going to do about it? We have the money if we reorganize ourselves, because at the moment we don't really attend to it, and therefore we're not putting the money into the social services and other institutions to deal with it. But in theory, we would have the money and also the remote technologies and ways of keeping an eye on people and helping them without necessarily being present with them, which will make this possible. And we have a commitment. We feel that even though one or other of these things may be failing, we can't just kill all these people off. You know, they may be stumbling around and falling and so on, but their mind is perfectly active, or the other way around.
Yeah.
So what do we do? Well, at the moment, we just put them in extremely expensive hospital beds, clutter up hospital beds, or if people are wealthy enough, they go into extremely expensive private residential accommodation. But we basically haven't been thinking about it. We haven't been thinking either about how to finance it, how to organize it, or how to make it more pleasant, because part of the aim with the third age was to actually relish the fact that you are able to do so much and to lead a meaningful life. Well, many of the people, even in the fourth age, can, if you think about it carefully, lead much more interesting lives than, say, sitting in a with 30 other old people in a room staring and watching television all day or whatever they do. I mean, they're very sad, many of these places, as we know. I've been thinking about this because, particularly recently, because several of my friends, and previously, obviously, Sarah and my family, were being eased from the third to the fourth age. And one characteristic of this, which I was thinking about, is the difficulty for the people. I mean, maybe I'm thinking about it because I'll never know when I might be being eased myself. Because characteristically, what happens is, Granny falls over again and you're worried about her, or her mind is wandering or something. What to do about Granny? Well, you've got a busy life. You want to get on with things. Our family system doesn't mean that you are basically financially responsible or even have legal responsibilities, but you feel guilt and you feel you should do something, but you haven't got the time or emotion to do very much. So you try and solve it quickly with a one-off thing. You try and get in someone to live with them, or most people know that it's absolutely hopeless in our family system to come and have them living with you, because very soon your whole life would be devoted to caring for them, or you turn them into children, or they turn you into children, or whatever. So it doesn't work by an extended household, and never has. I mean, no society has done that. No society has had sort of, in almost 1 in 3 or 4 houses, a very, very elderly, highly dependent relative living there. They couldn't economically have done that, and people would have died anyway. So what do you do about it? And how do you make their lives meaningful? Well, there are experiments going on which could be expanded. For example, I think in Holland, one thing about such people, particularly those who are suffering from memory loss, is that their memory is lost in an unequal way. In other words, it's usually their recent short-term memory that goes, and so they can't remember whether they've turned the kettle on or whatever, and so you have to do something about that. But they can remember perfectly well what they were doing in the summer of that lovely summer of 1976. It was a really wonderful summer, and they, the moment some tune, some Elvis or earlier bit of music comes on, they immediately perk up, because that has strong associations. So what they've done with these experiments is to recreate the world of these people in an earlier life. So they make shops which sell the kind of humbugs and licorice, all sorts that they used to buy, and you can go to these shops and you can, so they're, I mean, you could be unkind and say they're sort of recreationist or theme villages based on the world of the 1950s or 1960s or 1970s, where they play the music of that time and they have the material culture, you have all your possessions around you. And so you feel basically you are doing time travel back into, and then often these people perk up hugely because they have people around them who share those memories and interests. They can say, oh, look, listen, it's Vera Lynn again, and, sing along. Or let's go down to the shop and buy some, good old fashioned Yorkshire mints and whatever. And they become much more cheerful, much happier. I mean, you may say, well, it's a second childhood and so on, but if you compare that with the dreariness,
Yeah.
it seems worthwhile thinking.
And you can see ways in which things like VR, as that, virtual reality, as that
Yeah,
becomes more developed, that will really augment and supplement this sort
yeah.
of
Well,
thing.
just as with school children, you can create education which paces with the child, so that if they're speeding ahead in one thing and their classmates are holding them back, they can, through VR, move on faster down that stream. So you could do this. You can have individually tailored. I mean, people, to a certain extent, that's what these homes do. I mean, they probably find old Netflix movies and show them to the inhabitants on a one-off and occasional basis. But if you really think about it, I mean, I was also struck, and Sarah and I were struck some years ago, I think on our second or third visit to Japan, where they were beginning to face up to the problem of the third age and dependency in Japan. It was a new problem because before either they hadn't gone on or, the family would normally have absorbed them. But in the day of the salary man and very busy husbands and the wives not wanting to anymore to look after their mothers-in-law and fathers-in-law, suddenly Japan was faced in the 1970s with this whole set of unwanted older people. And by older, I mean in their 60s.
Yeah.
The working generation didn't want their old people with them. And so they started setting up residential old people's home. And we visited one and we spent a day in one. And in charge of it was a psychiatrist, a very advanced and thoughtful man. And he said he really studied old age and he had designed it. It was beautifully designed. So you had a communal area in the space in the middle where you could get together. And then off it, all the separate rooms where you had as much of your furniture as you could bring and your goods and so on. So you felt you had a personal, private world and people didn't go into those areas without your permission. It was like your little house. It was like a set in a Cambridge college. So it was based on that communal idea of living in a Cambridge college where you have the combination common room and joint eating facilities, but your private rooms as well. So you combine those two aspects. And that's how it was based. But also a recognition of what was important to these people's lives. And I was particularly struck. He said, these people are not suddenly become emotionally dead. For example, they're going to have love affairs. They're going to be attracted to other inmates. They're going to fall in love, even if they're in their 60s. And rather than trying to stop that, he says, within bounds, we encourage it. And we're very happy if people develop proper emotional relationships with other people and deeper ones. So he treated them as adults who just needed some protection. So that's another sort of thread in what you could develop. And it's something which is going to explode across the world, even in places like India and China, as the populations age. And rather than seeing it just as a threat and, oh dear, yet another problem and so on, if we allocate some time and some thought, and even overlap with the third age, there's no reason why, as long as their minds are fine, if it's just their body, that they shouldn't continue enjoying intellectual and mental and cultural stimulus. No reason why they shouldn't have painting classes, music.
That's right.